and welcome to Next Gen Finance, an SEB podcast about sustainable finance. My name is Lina Apsheva, and today I'm joined in the studio by the SEB Head of Sustainability Strategy and Policy, Karl-Oskar Olming. Karl-Oskar and I will talk about a topic that is impossible to avoid if you talk about sustainable finance, especially in a European context. This topic is the EU Taxonomy. I bet that most of you have heard about it before, but even if you haven't, that's okay, because we will talk about exactly what it is and also the process of how it is being developed and integrated into the financial market, as well as how it might possibly impact companies and individuals in Europe and maybe even in the world. So Karl-Oskar will also update us on the latest news surrounding this regulation and hopefully reflect a little bit on his own experience as a member of the European Commission's Advisory Expert Group on Sustainable Finance. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Karl-Oskar to the studio. Thank you so much for taking your time to talk to us today, Karl-Oskar.
Thank you, Lina. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, so let's just jump right in. What is the EU Taxonomy?
The EU Taxonomy is, you could say, a classification system of environmentally sustainable economic activities. So what does that mean? Well, it means that basically it's a regulatory framework that defines different activities and what is kind of the threshold you need to achieve in performance, environmental performance, in order to be called taxonomy aligned. And this is for a number of different activities and for 6 different environmental objectives. So it's for climate mitigation and climate adaptation, but also for upcoming objectives, which are biodiversity, pollution prevention, water and marine resources, and circular economy. So it's quite holistic in that sense.
Mm-hmm. So I believe you used the words regulatory framework. Does that mean that it's a regulation? So it's something that all companies will have to do in the EU in the coming years? Or is it more like, so far we've seen a lot of kind of recommendations in the sustainable finance market? Where does the taxonomy fall?
Right. So the taxonomy is a regulation, and that is interesting because in the Commission they have a number of different regulatory tools in a way. You can have guidance, you can have a directive, and if it's a directive, then each member state can implement it with their variations, but a regulation is the same everywhere. So once you have it in the taxonomy, it applies in the same way for all member states in Europe. And this is a regulation. But the important part here is that it's only the taxonomy regulation, so it's a framework directive. Under that, the Commission adopts delegated acts, and that's where you have the content of the activities and the objectives and the thresholds.
That's definitely something that we need, right? I think that's a great way to demonstrate how the sustainable finance market is developing, is starting with these self-imposed, you can say, requirements, and now moving to government level requirements that will be placed on actors in the financial markets. So you mentioned these 6 environmental objectives. Could you repeat one more time what they were?
So it's climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And those ones have already passed into delegated acts. So we already have that. But then there are another 4, and that is biodiversity, water and marine resources, pollution prevention, and circular economy.
So it sounds to me like it is very much focused on the environmental side of sustainability, not so much on the kind of social impacts.
That is correct. The EU taxonomy today is an environmental taxonomy. But at the same time, there are some minimum safeguards to ensure that you are not being taxonomy aligned on the detriment of social issues. So in order to be taxonomy aligned, you need to both fulfill the technical screening criteria for the specific environmental objective where you're active, but you also need to show that you do no significant harm to the other objectives. So you cannot play out one objective against another. And then you also need to show that you fulfill the minimum social safeguards. So in that way, there are some safeguarding mechanisms to make sure that we are not pulling in one direction at the cost of other areas.
Definitely. And you mentioned the word technical screening criteria. Could you elaborate a little bit on what that means? What is this criteria?
Yeah, so the technical screening criteria, that is the main KPI and threshold that is used in the taxonomy. So if we take, for example, in power generation and you look at a number of different sub-activities, the technical screening criteria is how many grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour that that activity is emitting, and the threshold there is 100 grams. If you do generation below that, then you are taxonomy aligned. So that is the technical screening criteria.
Great. And you mentioned energy generation. How many kind of sectors does the taxonomy cover? I guess energy generation is one of them, but what are some other examples?
Yeah, it's everything from a lot of different manufacturing industries. You have forestry, you have a lot of transportation industries, then you have the whole energy sector, and then you have water and wastewater and so on. So basically, the taxonomy has been developed by looking at which sector has the highest environmental impact for each objective. And those activities are then taken in, and screening criteria are developed. So it's a way of ensuring that you focus on the high impact activities and define what is environmentally sustainable in these high impact activities.
Interesting. And you mentioned this technical screening criteria as one of the kind of steps for ensuring that an entity is taxonomy aligned. What are some other steps? Could you elaborate about that?
So the other step is the do no significant harm compliance or requirement, which means that for a number of these activities, there have been defined do no significant harm criteria. So if you are, for example, producing energy, you might be using hydropower for that energy production, and then there are do no significant harm issues around water management and biodiversity, for example. And those do no significant harm are often based on, for example, EU legal requirements in that area.
To recap, basically, if a company were to say that they are taxonomy aligned, they would need to fulfill these criteria that are defined for each of the categories, the 6 categories that are defined in the taxonomy, but also make sure that they're not doing any significant harm when it comes to the other parts of the taxonomy.
The other objectives, yes.
The other objectives,
and then
yes.
finally, the minimum safeguards, which is more of a horizontal issue. So it's not that you do it for each activity, but it's how the business operates. What is interesting, though, and maybe a slightly different feature with the taxonomy compared to how we have done things in the past, is the fact that the taxonomy is actually a combination of financial reporting and environmental reporting, because the way you measure taxonomy alignment is either through how much your turnover is aligned with the taxonomy, or your capital expenditures or operating expenditures. So in that sense, you are actually looking at your revenues and you see how much of these revenues are in activities that are covered by the taxonomy, and of those activities, how much revenues are actually fulfilling or aligned with the requirements in the taxonomy regulation. And in that sense, investors, they are not going in and looking at the specific performance on biodiversity or on climate mitigation, but they are looking at your taxonomy alignment, and then they can see that in different areas. And that's a quite new way of doing this.
Very interesting, and no wonder that our clients are so kind of on this topic and really trying to understand it from all ways possible. But you talked a little bit about how it's a process, right, for the development of this criteria, and I'm wondering, what does that process look like?
Yeah, it's a rather lengthy process, even though it has been a lot has happened in a quite short time. The Commission, who is responsible for developing these delegated acts, they have at their service, you could say, the platform on sustainable finance, in which I'm a member. And what they are doing is that they are providing this platform with a mandate for each platform has a 2-year mandate, and during that mandate they give them tasks. So the task of the previous platform, which ended last year, was to develop the remaining 4 environmental objectives, activities that could go under the 4 environmental objectives. But they were also tasked with developing a conceptual notes on an extended taxonomy beyond green, a social taxonomy, and guidance on usability. What the Commission is that they take this advice and then they work with that internally with other directorates in the Commission. They look at is it really science-based? What is the usability of it? But also what is the political acceptability of it? And I think that is something that we really need to kind of take into account. The Commission, they take something from this advisory platform, but they need to work with it to make sure that it can be implemented and accepted in Europe. And then they come out with a delegated act that goes out for consultation, they take in some feedback, and finally it goes out for adoption. And once it has been adopted, there is a scrutiny period where both the member countries and the parliament could potentially say no to this delegated act before it enters into force. So it's a rather lengthy process with some kind of checks and balances in the way, but it's all driven, you could say, by the Commission.
And you mentioned that the expert group platform on sustainable finance gets renewed every 2 years. And I know that you were part of it for the past 2 years, and you've just gotten a renewed mandate as well. So congratulations on that. Could you share a little bit about what it's like to be on this expert group and who else is on the expert group, perhaps, and what it looks like?
Yeah, so this platform on sustainable finance is made out of, you could say, 3 different groups. One is the permanent members, so it's a number of EU bodies and their representatives. Then you have observers who are also from different relevant stakeholder groups. And then you have those that can actually apply for being a member of this group. And it's a big range of members, everything from professors and who are there on their own account. You have those that are representing different types of industry organizations or businesses and financial institutions, and those that represent different types of societal interests, you could say. It's slightly small, or it is definitely a smaller group than it was in the last platform. Then it was 58 members. Now I think it is 27 or 28 members. And then all these people are then divided up into what we call subgroups, depending on what tasks that the Commission has given us.
I'm wondering, I'm being a little bit curious now, what will it look like for you personally as a member of the group in the next 2 years?
The mandate of this platform is basically 3 different areas, to work with 3 areas. One is usability and data, very important, maybe the most important part. One is to continue with the activities, to develop a technical screening criteria for new activities or revise the existing ones. And the third part is to develop a methodology to monitoring capital flows, to really see whether they are being allocated to environmental sustainable investments. So it's a little bit of a feedback mechanism. And my specific role is that I am the co-rapporteur, so a co-chair of the Monitoring Capital Flows group, together with a colleague from the European Investment Bank.
I can only imagine how much work that must be, combining that with your role as the head of sustainability strategy and policy at SEB as well. I think a lot has been happening around taxonomy, and we get some news that have the EU Taxonomy kind of tagline in them almost every couple of weeks. And I know that we have just a few days before this episode is to be published, we got a new kind of news package. So could you update us a little bit about what the latest things that are happening in this area are?
Yeah, I think if you take a step back, I think this is the time when a lot of things are happening. And the reason for that is that the Commission needs to launch the things that needs to go through this year, because next year you have the European Parliament, elections for European Parliament, and then kind of the European Parliament closes down. So this is the time to do things. And we're seeing almost a little bit of fireworks coming from the Commission right now in terms of different packages coming out. The main one, from a taxonomy perspective, is of course that the delegated act on the remaining 4 environmental objectives was adopted. That means that from its adoption, it's 4 plus 2 months until it is the scrutiny period is over and it can enter into force. So now we know what is coming, and if we look at that one, we can see that it was not much on biodiversity, it was a lot on circular economy, and then it was some on both water and on pollution prevention. But I think so from that perspective, circularity is really the one that they are driving most. That is finding its place in many activities. So that is one part. The second part that I think is really interesting is that they came out with a transition package. And this transition package is basically about explaining how all the different EU frameworks that have come out from a sustainable finance perspective. You have the taxonomy, you have the sustainable finance disclosure regulation, you have the corporate sustainability reporting directive, and you even have something called the benchmark regulation. All of these things are now coming out in the market. But how do they relate to each other from a transition perspective? How can companies use all these different frameworks to explain what their transition journey is? We talk often about science-based targets, for example, but could you actually use a taxonomy from that perspective? So how is my taxonomy alignment going to go up, or how is my taxonomy capex looking? That will mean that I'm transforming. And how can you potentially relate that to other frameworks? I think this conceptually is quite interesting because it gives us a better understanding how the Commission is thinking about transition, which has been a little bit absent from the frameworks, but very prominent in the strategy of the Commission. And now we see how these two things are coming together. So that's the second part. The third part that has just come out is their usability package. And I think that also reflects what is the strategy of the Commission for these final 2 years. That is usability, to get it all to work. So basically what they're doing is that they are combining the different things that they've already published in terms of the EU Taxonomy Compass, which came out last year, the EU Taxonomy Calculator, which is also out now, with the FAQ that they have done, and they combine that with a user guide. So actually how to use the EU taxonomy in itself, and they deal with a few issues that have not been dealt with before, for example, use of estimates, and they then look at how to relate this to the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, where there are a lot of issues where some guidance is needed, and that's coming out in that usability package. So one real regulation, we could say, the Delegated Act. These other things are not regulations, but it's more guidance and that kind of more directional things, but they are not legislations per se.
All right, I think I'm beginning to understand, I can say, all the details, but the listeners of our podcast will know that I'm very passionate about the topic of biodiversity, for example, but you mentioned that the Commission is kind of focusing more on circularity. What does that mean in terms of the focus? Is the biodiversity criteria kind of on the shelf now, or can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at what the platform provided in terms of activities and activities that could go into this remaining 4 environmental objectives, I think it was around 74 different activities. And now what the Commission has gone out with is a little bit 30 plus activities. So they have not taken all of them. And those that really had, that did not pass, you could say, the Commission, was a lot in the biodiversity field. Now, why is that? Well, I think this is an area that is rather difficult politically, agriculture, forestry, all the industries using land and nature are rather difficult in the European Union. And therefore, I think it was difficult to really make sure that the indicators were robust enough, but potentially also this political acceptability that I talked about. I think right now the Commission wants to do things that are working both practically from a usability perspective, but also politically, because they don't have much time left to get it through. So I think, therefore, those more difficult topics, they are probably waiting until the next commission is coming in.
Yeah, I guess doing what is the easiest and what can be done now is a good approach, and leaving the more difficult parts for the future. But it'll be interesting to see how that develops further. So that's one part of the scrutiny that you mentioned, scrutiny, right, to the EU taxonomy. And I know that there have been other forms of criticism around this regulation, in addition to, of course, a lot of companies and organizations embracing it as well. But is there any type of criticism that especially stands out to you that maybe you would like to reflect on a little bit?
It's totally right. This is the first in its kind, you could say. And there are a lot of taxonomies following around the world. And there are some complexities. For example, we have the do no significant harm criteria. And they were developed very much using the EU as the reference point, which becomes very difficult when you go outside of the European Union. But there were also other issues. It was, I think, it didn't get as much attention when it was developed as the technical screening criteria. And so when I talk to clients and to companies today, we see that the technical screening criteria is often easier to work with than the interpretation of the do no significant harm. There are many interpretational issues. They are not as numeric, quantitative. They are more qualitative. It's more on legislation. They might even be uninterpretable if you say minimize or maximize and those kind of things. Where is the threshold? So I think that is one part, and I think we're all aware of that here. Work needs to be done. Then I think another part which is important is the whole international context. How do you apply the taxonomy outside of the European Union in the right way? And I think here we're getting more and more guidance on it. So I think those are areas that needs to be addressed, and I know that work is ongoing to do this, and I think that's an important message. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater in a way. There needs to be some time to really kind of process and improve this and align different frameworks with each other.
We have quite a few listeners who are professionals in different fields, or even on an individual level, they might be thinking, how will this regulation affect me and my work? Is there anything that you would like to tell them?
Well, you can take it from the micro perspective or the macro. From the micro, I mean, this means a new type of reporting, and it cuts in a different way. So it's a new way of reporting in the company that might not be the way that the organization structure is used to in companies. So that's definitely new. But then I must say, then we should also kind of embrace what this brings, this classification system, this definition of sustainable economic or environmental sustainable economic activities. And from that perspective, we are now having one language for investors, which means that it's easier to develop products. We'll see whether it's easier to talk to retail clients about this, but it's definitely so that you have kind of one yardstick to use in this and to compare companies doing the same activities. However, it is of course important to navigate in this with a lot of consciousness of the strengths and weaknesses of it. But I think going forward, it is actually a tool that can be used from everything from the informed private person who wants to kind of invest in different funds and so on, and they can start comparing, to financial institutions, investors who are thinking of product development, and of course companies who now can showcase their direction using the taxonomy, and with that potentially have easier access to capital.
Yeah, so let's hope that the taxonomy will achieve its goal of promoting sustainable finance and investments and environmental sustainability. So there's certainly a lot to talk about and a lot of angles that we can look at this topic from, but unfortunately we don't have all day, so we have to wrap up. But before I let you go, Karl-Oskar, I was wondering if there's one thing that you want a listener to take away from this episode, what would it be? What would you let our listeners go with?
Well, maybe it's don't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
That's a good one.
I think we are in a time in society when we are having a lot of transformations, and we also have regular transformations, and many of these are new in their in their field. Excuse me, and this really means that we need to give them a little bit of time to kind of find the way they work. So from that perspective, I think in a few years' time, these frameworks have been much more aligned, and the definitions have also been aligned, etc. So have a little bit of patience, basically.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Karl-Oskar. And as always, thank you very much to all of our listeners for tuning in this time. Don't forget that you can always send questions or requests for topics for us to cover in the future to nextgenfin@seb.se. And also, please feel free to share this podcast with your friends or anyone who might be interested in listening. So until next time, but for now, take care and goodbye.